I'm a Prometheus founder, and I'm here because I think, uh, and I'm primarily interested in leadership. But to me, if we're good at not pretend leadership and bullshit leadership, but real leadership, we are able to engage each other on important topics and instantiate or create change in not only our organizations but our society. And so this is a conversation that I think is really important and that we're not good at having. And so I'm hoping we'll be much better at having this conversation after today. How do you form, how do people form their identity? How do they define themselves in terms of race? And is this helpful or hurtful?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to see you, especially familiar faces, Sam, Bradford, Starlet. So good to hang with y'all. Um, so I'm Sheena Mason. I'm an assistant professor at SUNY Oneonta. I'm in an English department, and I specialize in all things Africana studies and literature. And my research has led me to the development of what I call the theory of racelessness, or alternatively, raceless anti-racism. And from a very high level overview, that's a bit about what we're going to get into today.
So bring us in.
Okay. So, all right, let me start my PowerPoint then. All right. So I have a book coming out in February, and the title of the book is The Raceless Anti-Racist: Why Ending Race is the Future of Anti-Racism. And in approaching today's conversation by exploring some of what I present in the book, by the end of our time together, you'll better be able to say what you think race is and what you think should be done with it and why. And then hopefully you'll feel inspired to engage with fresh pathways to a future without racism. I will just ask if you're not on mute to go ahead and hit the mute button now. Raceless anti-racism, also known as the theory of racelessness, is a framework, a lens for analysis that illustrates how the undoing of racism requires the undoing of the belief in race, the idea that humans comprise different races, and the practice of racialization, which is the application of races to humans, to undo the subsequent power imbalances and dehumanizing effects. The theory inspires a more astute identification and analysis of racism in any given context. It helps people stop the unintentional upholding of racism by ceasing to uphold race ideology, its corresponding language, and the subsequent constructed and limiting worldviews. As such, it helps to stop the lesser discussed but greatly impactful effects of racism. Raceless anti-racism is also a philosophy, a theory of race that extends and explores the boundaries of what's called racial skepticism and delineates more precise paths towards racial eliminativism, which I interpret as enabling us to free ourselves from racism and its harmful causes and effects. Such transcendence allows us to recognize our individual and collective cultural and ethnic pluralism, a prerequisite awareness that leads society toward embracing cosmopolitanism, where every human is rightly humanized, not racialized or ethnicized. Today, our focus will be on the broader field of philosophy of race, including the philosophies that I just mentioned that underpin the theory, and then we'll give an overview of the rules of the theory. So in the field of philosophy, there's actually a specialization called philosophy of race. There are 6 philosophies of race, 3 that answer the question, what is race? Race is either hereditary, synthetic, or imaginary. And the other 3 answer, what should we do about race? We should preserve it, reform it, or terminate it. Each of us holds 2 philosophies of race, one from each category, even without having the language to name, this is my philosophy of race. If you believe that race is hereditary, it is biological. If you hold that race is synthetic, you believe that race is a real phenomenon that is human-made. If you contend that race is imaginary, like me, you know that race isn't biological and therefore it doesn't exist. But my skepticism goes even further to indicate that race is also not a social construction. For me, racism is the social construction. My view of race as imaginary comes from a bit of the history or the context of what race is, what racialization is, that lead me to this imaginary belief. But before I go more into that, I want to demonstrate the difference between saying that race is synthetic or saying that it's a construction and saying it's imaginary and being a full-blown skeptic about race. So for most folks, race as a social construction, you might say things like race isn't real, it's constructed, right? But for something to be constructed, it has to be real. Its realness is just signified by the fact that humans made it. So the shirt that I'm wearing, it's synthetic, right? Humans made this shirt. I can't go out into nature and find this shirt just like in the ground or in the water somewhere. And yet, although it's synthetic, it's still real. We could talk about how it looks. We could talk about how it feels. We could talk about what it's made out of. In that way, we can define it. There are certain specific parameters that we can pin ourselves into as it pertains to this synthetic, this human-made shirt. So for a constructionist about race who argues that race isn't biological, but it's synthetic, it's still real. As a full-blown skeptic about race, I cannot point to anything that is presumed or presented to be race or racial and agree with folks that that thing that you're calling race is real, because I can always translate what presents as race or racial into something else, namely into ethnicity or into social or economic class, into culture, into racism itself. And my ability to constantly translate what people point out and say, but what about this, Sheena? This is race over here. And I'm like, no, that's not race. That's this, right? That's what makes the culture, the social construction of culture, the social construction of class or ethnicity or racism. Those constructions are real to my mind as a skeptic. However, the fact that people call it race doesn't make race real to my mind. And so that distinction between constructionism and skepticism, or calling race synthetic versus calling it fully imaginary, that's the primary distinction that I invite you to hold on to. Now, as I get to the question of what should we do with race, I'm an eliminativist. And so what underpins the theory is an eliminativist philosophy or way of looking at race. That's the Terminator category. Whatever you consider race to be, my contention is that we should get rid of it, right? We should undo it, throw it in the trash bins of forgotten history. Now, as an eliminativist, most skeptics are eliminativists. But you can also contend that race is synthetic, that it is a construction, and be an eliminativist, be a terminator about race. And I actually was a constructionist eliminativist up until maybe a couple of years ago, before I switched to full-blown skepticism. And one of my mentors, a philosopher at Howard University, is a constructionist eliminativist. So one needn't agree that race is fully imaginary to hold an eliminativist position about race. And the theory of racelessness reflects racelessness in terms of race being imaginary and racelessness in terms of aspiration, right? The fact that most people believe in race in some way, and the fact that we operate in societies that assign race to human beings through racialization, means that there's something to get rid of. Racialization, again, is that process of applying an inescapable social and or economic hierarchy to human beings. There's nothing positive about being racialized. In every context, racialization arises out of the interaction of a group with another group that it dominates and assigns a racial identity for the purpose of continued domination and social exclusion. Across human history, people have concocted the idea of race and subsequent identities to reflect and maintain existing or desired divisions. In time, differently racialized groups often come to embrace their racialization and its corresponding language for a variety of reasons that can be conscious or subconscious. People who are racialized as Black in the United States, for example, understandably often unify and coalesce around the racialization they inherit to instill pride and encourage upward mobility and success. Regardless of one's racialization, we each inherit and get assigned a racial identity that we then must navigate and reconcile with who and how we actually are, especially in relation to each other. Infrequently, people push back against their racialization, and particularly how racialization works to create and maintain divisions that we would all do well to remove from outside the bounds of that same racialization. As a strategy for resistance, most people accept their racialization even as they reject the negative effects of it, which creates the paradox. Where there remains the belief in race, anything outside of the singular human species, the practice of racialization, the dehumanization of the believers and the receivers remain the effects and outcomes of believing in race. Everyone is racialized, including the groups doing the racialization. And there is nothing positive about being racialized. Human history shows us that. In the US, we need language and frameworks like the theory of racelessness or raceless anti-racism that helps to stop the machinery of racism and enables us to create the limitless future we want for future generations. And we must start this future making today, no matter how hard it seems that it may be. Nowadays, the causes for racism look differently absent chattel slavery, but it's still a profit-making, divisive endeavor that most people do not benefit from. Racism is largely self-maintained because of the belief system, the knowledge system that was built centuries ago, but that we've continued to accept and uphold. Our government, the media, the education system continue to play significant roles in upholding racialization and reinforcing racialized identifications to the detriment of everyone where different races are presumed to exist. Race isn't and has never been just skin color or phenotype, some immutable characteristic. If that were true, then race would have a true biological basis that causes disdain, indifference, or adoration in people. Race would be the cause for racism. But in fact, race isn't skin color or phenotype, DNA, culture, or whatever you want to call it. In Reflection, Race and the Human, Charles Mills, a philosopher, posits that race, whether formally designated as such or not, generally comes to signify the fully human and the subhuman, whether genuinely within the human community or outside it. The subhuman as actually not human at all. Race often reflects the belief in race, practice of racialization, and the subsequent social and or economic power imbalances, which is how I came to define racism and as I do. It's also how I come to spell racism as I do, which is with the word race in it. What presents as race is reflective of the causes and effects of social or economic hierarchies and the dehumanization required to create and maintain those hierarchies. In The Raceless Anti-Racist, I apply the theory of racelessness and illustrate how, more often than not, race translates into both the cause and effects of racism itself. Thus, when I say that race doesn't exist in nature or as a social construction, I mean that Black and white, when applied to humans, do not exist outside of the machinery of racism. Black is designated to those assumed to be inferior, subhuman if human at all, and white is designated to those assumed to be superior. All other non-white designations indicate varying levels of subhumanness according to race ideology in the US. According to Mills, race puts into question the full humanity of the stigmatized racial groups. When best understood, our imposition and presumption of race results in our sometimes unintentional maintenance of a hierarchy, a dehumanization of one another, of ourselves. Racism is a social construction that necessitates our continued, mostly blind belief in and upholding of race ideology and its correlated language and practices. We just continue to fool ourselves into thinking that race is just skin color or phenotype, DNA, ethnicity, or culture. Racism includes and often masquerades as what people believe is race and the practice of racialization. In other words, racism hides its face as race. So if you imagine an episode of Scooby-Doo, we're chasing after the villain and the villain says race and very stereotypically and plainly has a black and white mask. And we catch the villain and we demask the race villain, and out pops 5 different entities, all looking differently than the race figure, right? In those 5 entities: culture, ethnicity, social class, economic class, and racism. Part of the theory requires this kind of translation of what presents to be race into these other more astute categories, so that the dehumanization that results from the racism, which is hiding its face there, can actually be acknowledged and subsequently undone. In this way, I come to define race and racism, indicated here as a single word, in the following way: a social and or economic class hierarchy of humans based on the belief in race, practice of racialization, and subsequent reinforcement of various power imbalances, or what I call hierarchies. Now, as a racial skeptic, when I talk about the non-existence of race, and I say things like race is racism, what I'm really indicating is that in my conception and definition of racism as it's traditionally spelled, right, without the word race in it, because I define that word in the way that I've indicated here, the sameness of race and racism becomes clearer. Racism then becomes the real thing, right? The reality. And the fiction of race is part and parcel of that. And that makes it a thoroughly pernicious category to my mind. And the need to separate racism from culture or ethnicity, social class, and economic class becomes critical, because something like culture can actually offer value to folks, right? There can be pernicious aspects of culture like racism, but there can also be valuable, beneficial aspects of culture. And if we can free ourselves from how racism encourages and requires us to see something like culture as an example, then we can recognize that the only thing the theory of racistness advocates us to undo is the thoroughly pernicious practice and machinery of racism, not the valuable things or the valuable aspects of our so-called identities or culture. So that distinction matters. Now, how do I define racelessness? As I mentioned earlier, racelessness, to my mind, and as part of the theory, reflects these 2 philosophies of race: skeptical eliminativism. And at the same time, this can also reflect constructionist eliminativism. There are plenty of people who advocate for the abolishing of race as a category and as a practice, who contend that race is a construction. But that needn't be a hang-up for folks. You can still be a terminator of race. You can still advocate for the termination of race as a constructionist. In the United States, we actually get defaulted into philosophies of race that enable us to maintain the machinery of racism in really paradoxical, but also intended ways. We get defaulted into believing that race is hereditary or synthetic, i.e., biological or a construction. And we get defaulted into believing that we should preserve race or reform it, that is, reconstruct it. Seldomly do we learn about skeptical eliminativism or the belief in full-blown, race as an illusion, as imaginary, and race as something that we should get rid of, that we should terminate. And when philosophies of race that are uncommonly taught and very commonly misunderstood, when those philosophies crop up, the tendency is to try to squash, silence, discredit, devalue, and hide those other ways of seeing race. And so a big part of the work that I do when I'm sharing my theory is educating people about all of the philosophies of race, and then opening the door to the lesser known, commonly misunderstood philosophies of race. As anti-racism has looked and continues to look in places like the States, you actually see the attempted reconstruction of the category of race across time, from the days of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs to the time during the Harlem Renaissance, when people are fighting for their civil rights and trying to end Jim Crow, to the civil rights movement, to Black Lives Matter movement. All of the efforts in the United States that have centered resistance to racism and an attempt to overcome and stop some of the obstacles presented by racism have also been a reconstructed effort in terms of what people think it is to be racialized as Black, to try to write humanity into the category, to assert it, right? Like, the reason why some people have to say Black Lives Matter or my life matters as a Black person is because that category as race was created during the times of chattel slavery, when to be Black meant to be chattel, right? To be a beast, to be property, to not be human. And time after time, decade after decade, generation after generation, we get co-opted into the system of race ideology and into the system of fighting against racism through the ideology. And the theory seeks to open the door to fighting both the ideology, which is the required machinery of racism, in order to finally, right, stop the causes and effects of said racism. So now I want to invite you, number one, I think we should have a little bit of time for some questions and answers about the philosophies of race and the philosophies that underpin the theory. So I'm happy to engage in conversation. And then we're going to spend some time again in a breakout room where you'll have a chance to answer these questions for yourself, right? Do you see yourself as believing that race is hereditary, synthetic, or imaginary? And what do you think should be done with race? Should we preserve it? Should we reform it? Or should we terminate it? And why? So in a few minutes, you'll be able to talk in a breakout room in response to these questions and try to clarify and put language to how you see race and what you think should be done with it.
Rose here. No questions, but a comment. You have so much to say here and unpack, so forgive me if I'm not getting all of it. What struck me, though, was the power imbalance. That, for me, is, I believe, the core at what you're talking about, in addition to everything else. But that is an issue in our society, whether that's race or not. So that if we could kind of balance out so-called power, what would that look like? Anyway, comment, not a question, but maybe you can expand upon that later.
Thank you, Rose, for your comment. Yeah, the question of power is something I think about obsessively, because I think in some ways we get kind of co-opted into thinking about power as only or primarily economic. And yet I see more and more literature that is more and more studies showing the effects of racism as it pertains to the psychological and social aspect of how racism harms folks. And part of my part of how I've come to think about power or recognize power is ultimately centering the individual as, despite external factors, being able to have a certain worldview or toolkit that can change how they, number one, change how they might experience racism, something like microaggressions, for example, to be tangible here. And also how they might free themselves from internalized racism to recognize and embrace and like live out the power that we can have as individuals. I think too often we make power about the outside, and that's there. That's certainly part of the discussion and the solution making efforts. And there's also on an individual level how we can talk about and think about power, and how, regardless of whether or not those people over there stop doing the thing, I can have a toolkit to free myself from some of these strictures and live arguably a fuller life, you know. Let's see. I see a question in the chat. I wonder what news story needs to be told to support this theory in an even more polarized world. I think you'll see in the book that's coming out, The Racist Anti-Racist, I actually conceptualize as part of the theory 10 different concepts that I've picked up through my extensive research and study of African American literature and Caribbean literature. And one of the concepts, for example, is something that I call twilight. And in the book, I demonstrate what operating in a twilight space, how that can look, how that becomes essential to bringing more people together in ways that, because we're actually forced to be in a binary, to think in binaries, right? It's either, everything is either good or bad, black and white, pun intended, etc. The twilight is inviting us to participate in and recognize the in-between, or the gray space, the twilight space. And whether that's involving historical analysis, which through the book I'm doing and presenting, and whether that's presenting what seem to be contradictory or even opposing views about any number of topics that we could point to as reflecting the sort of divisiveness that we're living out. The theory, in any context, I think you mentioned earlier that you're in Poland, in any context actually empowers us to look at with more clear eyes what otherwise seems to be black and white ideas, black and white positions, to get to the middle ground and actually play in the middle ground, which I think is required for any of us to move forward together as opposed to moving forward apart.
So, Sheena, what about racelessness then? Is the alternative?
All right, thank you. And welcome back, everyone. I hope you had rich discussions. I'm sure you did. Definitely in my group, we did, and I hope to continue those conversations. So we've spoken a bit about philosophy of race. And if you still feel like you're trying to wrap your head around all the different philosophies, perhaps even where you stand on the philosophies and why, I'm with you. I've been toiling over this for at least 2 decades, so it's not exactly something that one comes to immediately. So just consider this an invitation to keep reflecting. The theory of racistness, I said at the outset, is a lens, right? It's a framework for analysis. And so what that means is that there are tenets or rules to the theory. There's language component to it. There are different tools, the primary tool being the racelessness translator, but also tools I mentioned earlier, like Twilight. And so anyone can engage with the entirety of the theory, right? The tenets, the language, the tools, and adapt them to their own unique context, and get the benefit of doing that kind of work. And my students have described it as intellectual, emotional, and spiritual work. And in a lot of ways it is. And I can attest from my own personal journey that it continues to be so. Now, I have the tenets of the theory up on the screen here. So what are the rules of the theory? The rules are that our belief in race and practice of racialization are meaningful because racism and valuable aspects of humanity hide behind what we call race. You might remember my Scooby-Doo analogy that I gave at the outset. Race does not exist in nature for humans or as a social construction. As I've said, racism is the social construction. Race is an illusion. Although we are all racialized by ourselves and other people, we are still raceless. In other words, we're still all part of the human species. And no amount of believing that that's not true actually makes it so. We are not made white or black, for example, because of the process of racialization. We're simply made to appear white or black as an effect of racialization. And that distinction really matters if we're sincere in our desire to go forward together. Racism is a social and/or economic class hierarchy of humans based on the belief in race, practice of racialization, and the subsequent reinforcement of hierarchies. In the United States, the hierarchy places people who get racialized as white at the top and those who get racialized as black at the bottom. But racialization is the process of applying an inescapable hierarchy to humans. But racism does not exist everywhere in the same way. And what I mean there is that, notice when I'm talking about racism, I talk about it and I say explicitly in the context of the US, this is what it looks like, right? Because as a philosopher of race on a global level, I recognize that if I go to a different country, the hierarchy, right, racism is going to operate differently. There's going to be different language, perhaps there's going to be different expectations. There's going to be a different history inevitably. Even if there are parallels, there's going to be a difference. So these rules of the theory are meant to be applicable on a broader scale, and the context that comes behind these rules will be discoverable in each country, and in that way unique to each country, even if again there are some parallels. And some philosophers describe this phenomena as saying that race doesn't travel. And the final tenet, perhaps the most crucial one, is that we can overcome racism. Now, how do I define anti-racism? Well, I define it as written there on the screen, and I spell it as written there on the screen. Notice the eliminativist philosophy, the Terminator philosophy is signified by my spelling of anti-racism. Anti-racism is a policy and practice of identifying and ending the causes and effects of racism by effectively centering shared humanity. And if you go and you look up, on Google, what is the definition of anti-racism, I will point out that the primary distinction between how I define anti-racism and how people tend to define anti-racism comes down to the very language of my definition signifies the ending the causes and effects of racism, whereas most people tend to think of it as a forever and always fight against, right? We're fighting against racism forever and always. And I know that if we get it right, it doesn't have to be a perpetual battle. We can actually center each other's humanity in ways that eliminate the hierarchies. And I'm not striving for a utopia because I'm not naive, because other forms of hierarchies will still exist and persist, right, as they do in addition to racism. And at the same time, I don't see any of that as a reason to maintain the system of racism. Like we can nip this in the bud. In The Raceless Anti-Racist, Why Ending Race is the Future of Anti-Racism, each chapter builds on the other in chronological order and out of order, as the following tools of the theory interrelate and interconnect. The tools include architecture, madness, twilight, the walking negative, rememory, invisible ink, consolation, maternal energy, diaspora, nation, and home. Each chapter infuses every aspect of the theory of racelessness into itself, even as I explain and show what each aspect is. I use a combination of literary, historical, philosophical, cultural, qualitative, and quantitative analysis to illustrate the theory itself, including the knowledge it brings to the fore, and also show the theory in application. And I explain while also illustrating the lens that is the theory, and show how and why the lens and the philosophies of race that we inherit fall short of the goal of ending the causes and effects of racism. So this is, again, intended to be not a comprehensive, but a eagle eye view of what the theory offers, what's presented in my next book, and also a sincere invitation for engagement and potential collaboration for anyone interested, as I've only gotten to this place of development because of other people's willingness, right? People from various specializations and industries and countries to engage with my work and have conversations with me and to share other things that I should read, etc. I think no matter what we're doing, we are better together, and I practice what I preach. So consider this a sincere invitation for further discussion. And with that, Tom, if we have time for it, which we should, we could open it up for some more dialogue, whole group, before going into our next breakout group. What do you think? Feel free to sound off in the chat box. Also, just hit the raise your hand icon if you want to comment or ask a question.
Could you had a couple examples of things that you're in your book. I think I would call them maybe strategies for racelessness. Could you just explain one or two of those? Sorry.
Are you thinking of when I was talking about the tools?
Yes, the tools.
Okay, so the tools, I wouldn't exactly say that they're strategies, but in terms of strategy, in the last breakout group I was in, one of the topics that came up was how, on the one hand, there's a desire to terminate the concept of race and the practice of racialization. On the other hand, it can feel impossible because of how entrenched we might be in our various contexts. And so when I think about the history of humanity, like how long humans have been on this earth, and the short amount of time that race ideology and the ways that many of us experience it has existed. I actually take hope in the fact that race ideology and the ways that we currently existed in the modern world is very young. And if you think about and reverse engineer, right, how did the ideology come into fruition? Well, the concept of race existed in various parts of the world going, let's say 5 centuries back. The concept of race existed, and it was always attached to, or it was often attached to some type of hierarchy, whatever the economic and social hierarchy was in early modern Europe, for example, or in Rome, right? Race was indicative of inferior, superior statuses. And so early modern Europeans, when they come to the Americas, they say, or what would become America, they say, we have this economic and social class system that's on the ground, namely through chattel slavery, and we would like to maintain this. There's this handy, concept of race that exists in different parts of the world. And also the language of white and black exists, right? With all of everything negative in the world being attached to darkness and everything positive in the world being attached to whiteness. So we're going to take this language and we're going to make it race, right? And in that way, we can maintain the class system that's already on the ground. And so through media, through education, through the government, these are the primary ways in which the ideology starts to infiltrate society and people adopt and inherit that ideology, that belief system. And then that becomes a well-oiled, a sort of self-oiled machine, because so long as the education system is maintaining it, the media, the government, the technology of racism then becomes maintained. So to undo it to undo racism and effectively stop it, our strategy should look very similar to what the strategy was to start it in the first place. And so there's no one thing, like people want practical, right? They want practical, they want immediate. And I'm like, that's not how this works. It can't work like that. If it worked like that, we would be out of the quagmire, right? So I point back to the fact that something like the theory of racistness has rules, it has tools, and it has a language component. And in all, if a person engages with the entirety of the theory and starts to internalize and practice the various components in the tools, then we can start the work of, as a society, infusing the aspects of the theory into our education system, into the government, into the media. And if we can do that, then we can reverse engineer the whole thing. And I'm not pretending that's going to be easy. Okay. I already know this is not going to be easy because there's money to be made off of maintaining the status quo. However, if enough people become eager to create a future outside of this thing, right, together, then there's no stopping us. There's no stopping us, but we have to remain eager despite the fact that it's going to be very hard work. And we have to be strategic in terms of thinking of the buckets that I've named and put forth. And we have to be smart in terms of recognizing there's no single thing I could say that's going to like unlock this thing for you as an individual, much less for an entire country, right? Like we have to do all of the things. And then together we can start to look at some of the aspects of the matrix and reverse engineer the thing. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I know that we're supposed to have a special segment on like commercials, but what you're saying reminds me of really our next guest in 2 weeks on Voices, Nora Bates, and I just read her new book, and a lot of what she talks about is the fact that kind of this retractable systemic change, which she says, uses racism as an example and climate change and these things that we just can't seem to get past. Her passion is how do we actually approach these systemic things? And I don't know how satisfying her answer is, but she's got a lot of interesting ways to think about it. So I invite, I'll pre-advertise the session with Nora in 2 weeks for people who want to know, how do we approach this? I think her answer is kind of like, you kind of can't control it, but you gotta just move things to let them coalesce. Maybe as I'm putting words in her mouth, but that feels right to me here. There's so much, there's so many forces sustaining the status quo that it's hard to make a direct change without getting pushback, for example. So, but what do? When do you push back? If someone brings up race as even a way to frame a conversation, uh, economic justice, or teaching the history of racism, your race is automatically there. I think you make the distinction between racism and economic justice, for example, and say, well, and make sure people are clear on what they're talking about and what they're not talking about. It's still a sticky thing. Sorry, I'll stop babbling. Let other people babble.
Well, that brings up a doorway for me to further clarify what I contend versus how I think many people what many people think I'm contending. So I'm a person who is not advocating for us to skip to the good part and now all of a sudden we're not using race language, not for nothing. This came up in the last group I was in too. France kind of tried to do that. Let's just take race off of all of our data collection points and yada yada yada, and then we see that that's not exactly working out in the way that I guess they thought it was going to. So I'm not actually contending for any of that. And it is my position that if a person fully engages wholeheartedly on a personal level with something like the theory through my next book, then a person would be infinitely more understanding of the position of other people who are operating from either a place of color blindness or operating from a place of we need to see and embrace race, right? You come to have a very clear understanding of what people mean in these different examples or instances. And I will tell you, I don't make it a habit of trying to correct people if I did because I disagree with the language they're using or something like that. I don't feel like I have to do any of that because I understand what people mean. And I think the lack of understanding about what people mean or why some people think race is the all significant thing or category or whatever, I think the lack of understanding of where people are actually coming from actually contributes to our constant, butting of heads, if you will. And it forces us into an impasse. But if you engage with the theory, my sincere hope is that you can come out on the other end of reading this next book and really recognizing, understanding I actually understand what people mean when they're coming at it from these different ways and the history of why people come at it from these different ways. And I recognize that the real people or the real entities that need to be held accountable for change to get us out of this mess, education, government, media, right? And so we're not each other's enemies, right? But we're made to feel like we are each other's enemies because of the machinery of racism. But if we can understand each other, that's fundamental. And then and only then can we get out of it. And then the last thing I'll say too is I demonstrate in the book, we can't skip to the good part, but and we shouldn't. But when I think about early education and I think about what would this look like in practice in early education, I think about how presenting all of the philosophies of race, something as simple as that, right? Never mind the rest of the theory, just the philosophies of race. And if it's a history class, delving into the philosophies of race and looking at the process and practice of racialization from a historical standpoint to help us understand and contend with the world today, that to me would be game changing, because then we'd be raising a generation of young people who aren't in the quagmires that you and I find ourselves in, of having to unlearn and relearn and understand and get outside of the matrix if we choose to. That to me is a crucial component of this. We don't have to, it is hard to unlearn or relearn, but it doesn't have to be that way if we get the early education component right. We can open the door from the outset to all of the ways that people have thought about race or can think about race. and then create pathways to a future beyond racism.
Rose.
I feel like I'm asking too many questions, but I'm going to be provocative, Sheena, and this comes from a good place. I'm sure you get criticism for what you're advocating. And some of the ones I'm thinking of, these are not my personal opinions, but what about lived experiences of those who have been marginalized because of what they look like, what community they come from? And it's that you mentioned a little bit about the trauma, the getting past that, and so that's one. The other one is, and you talked a little bit about this just now. You can't get to where you need to get to right away. There's some challenges to get there. And the notion of hierarchy, like I also do leadership consulting, and more and more organizations, they're not the typical hierarchy. They're becoming more flat. There's a real desire from employees, especially this the generation now coming into the workforce, where it's not the workplace that I was in, for example. There's more expectation to be involved in decision making, etc. So those are some that I think would come up. It's not really clear, how to deal with some of those challenges that many of us are living or have seen. And there is, you mentioned the status quo, that perhaps there's some advantages to keeping it the same, because hierarchies can create order, they can create stability, and so how does this theory help with that? I don't know if that's provocative enough, but
thanks, Rose. So the first part of your comments about the lived experience of being marginalized, I don't see how anything I'm saying isn't directly addressing that up front. So not to be cheeky, but the entire premise and the reason the theory of racistness came into being was because I was obsessed and remain obsessed with studying all things race and racism for over 20 years. And when I first started studying, I was coming from a place of recognizing myself in the literature that I was reading. I started out immersing myself in African-American literature primarily. And I saw that the writers and the figures that I was studying were all in conversation with each other and trying to advance human rights efforts in the United States. And I wanted to be part of that solution-making effort. So I was audacious enough to think that I could contribute let me put this in quotation marks, oh Lord, to solving racism, okay? Because I saw that, the ancestors, that's what they were doing. And so I wanted to be part of that. So nothing I say, nothing I'm offering the world flies in the face of any of that. In fact, it affirms it, right? Because there can be no stopping racism if my point is that racism isn't a thing that people experience. And I will also add, in our breakout group, we talked about like experiencing sexism, for example. I mean, you name it, I probably experienced it, right? So I'm just gonna put it out there. And I will add that because of these different kinds of lived experiences, that makes work like mine more critical to my mind and more beneficial, because something I said earlier was something to the effect of how we often make liberation about the outside. Like I can only be free if those people over there stop doing X, Y, and Z. And yet the one thing those of us in this room probably know is that we can only control what we're doing. Right? We can only control ourselves. And so what does it look like to have toolkits that actually help people to stop internalizing particular types of trauma? and what does it look like to, instead of constantly identifying racism as a problem in all of these various fields that exist today, to actually like working to solve some of the some of those problems. Like the people who profit off of the continued status quo aren't the people that many of us get tricked into thinking it's like it's helping. It's not, it doesn't help the average person. The average working class person, it does not help. And I would point to the status of our economy in the United States, the economy here, as part of my evidence for that. Like, how much for anyone in the States grocery bill, are you kidding me? Like, it's absolutely ludicrous right now just to like walk outside and exist. And so thinking about the history of racism in a place like the United States, recognizing how back in the day the elite, right, who tended to be racialized as white, they, with actual like real wealth, right, they saw that the working class folks saw themselves as aligned with each other and voted similarly in different communities, and then they came in, burnt everything down, threatened to lynch elected politicians, did race massacres to, and then did a media campaign to convince the working class so-called white folk that they weren't at all alike the so-called black folk in the same town, right? And it was effective because then it actually made working class people vote differently depending on how they got racialized. And how pernicious is that? All to maintain the status quo where the elite are really the ones winning the day and the rest of us are just, pawns. So that gets into addressing like the second part of your question, like this question of aren't there advantages to like hierarchies and isn't there order? In the book, when I talk about madness as a tool of the theory, I actually talk about how madness is a direct result of our attempts to create order, right? Because actually what's created out of these different categories and assignments of identities is complete madness and disorder. And if we just let ourselves be human and be however it is that we're going to be, like we would have different outcomes. So I'm not buying it. I'm not buying. I definitely don't benefit from the hierarchy, but some folks do. Also, I'll just say to be continued, Rose. I'm sure we're gonna talk more after this.
Thank
Any
you.
more hands?
Thank you, Sheena.
Oh, go ahead. Who's got?
I'm
Oh,
smiling because the room is pretty calm today, which is not the case all the time. And I really want to thank you, Tom, for inviting Sheena. Thank you so much. We need more people like you because we are not enemies. And we need to raise this kind of discussion more and more. We have no other choice because our future depends on what we can do of that. Just see what's going on in Israel and Palestine. This is just something small. But if we want to tackle that kind of situation that is being on for centuries, we need to raise the discussion. And I have a dream. And this dream will come true.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean Alvier. I'll raise my hand again and just reflect a little bit on as Prometheus thinks about leadership, we think of three kind of things that leaders do, and leaders being everybody in this room is like we create things, we get things done, and we bring people along. And we make sense of things, we clarify what's going on. And a lot of this discussion about racism and racelessness is part of that clarification. But the third thing we do is that um, we are present to each other. We build presence to each other as humans. We see each other and we interact with each other as humans because that's the creative space. That's the creative relationship that takes place. That's how we do problem solving and learning, is when we create that. And it's not a lot of leadership stuff is about maybe creating emotional safety or psychological safety, which is part of it, but it's really about being present and learning how to see each other as people. And this is kind of the magic intersection that I'm hearing from Sheena. If we're not talking about race or racism, or we're not trying to fix that, then what are we talking about? And the gap is then, well, how do we meet each other as humans? What's a effective way to do that? And that is not very established, I don't think, in our communities. We're more hiding and more in our identities and our groups, which become then the fuel for conflict and disagreement and disconnection. I didn't mean to preach, but that's my thinking. And I guess I'm just, Sheena, this idea of being better at understanding how people are human. This is part of the solution here.
Oh, certainly. And expanding what we generally think about as it pertains to what it means to be human. And part of that requires a recognition of who up until this point has decided who's human and who's not human. The category itself becomes controversial in a way, because in the example I give about when chattel slavery is already on the ground, and early modern Europeans concocting and conjuring race as a means to maintain that hierarchy, that was a reconstructive effort as to what it means to be. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Take care. As to what it means to be human in the first place, and deciding that, we're human and those people over there aren't human. And we see that time and time again, the conflict that's happening abroad, all of what humans tend to do to each other includes some of the vile things that I think too often we like to dismiss as not being human, right? If we're not being humane, then that's not part of what it is to be human. But I'm like, no. If we're going to actually consider what it is to be human, then we have to be able to recognize all of what it is to be human, and perhaps especially the ugly parts, so that we can really reconcile and reckon with our own potential to do the thing that we say or would think that we would never do, right? Because we're more human than other people.
So Bradford, we haven't heard from you today. What are you thinking?
Hi, everybody. I was actually just thinking, Tom or as the group is kind of offering thoughts and dreams and hopes of how to come together, whether it's on racial conflict or socioeconomic conflict or religious conflict. I was just having a little reverie moment and thinking that we must be hungry, we must cooperate to obtain food, and then we need to eat together. That's how we fix things. And I think as this applies to our current racial divide, I have a lot of hope with our younger population as they're coming up. I don't see my children, who are 7 and 9, and the teenagers that I see, at least in my neighborhood, I don't see them dividing themselves on so-called race. I do believe they are inundated in racism, and I have hope that as they are making their relationships and being exposed to what the older generation is wrestling with, and you know, however successfully, that the younger generation will be hungry for something better. And I already see them cooperating more, and playing together, and hopefully that will translate to, you know, literally and figuratively eating together. And I agree with Sheena so much that starting with ourselves, with the man in the mirror, and then having the conversations with our neighbors, with our friends, whomever we're breaking bread with our school board members. Right, I've got neighbors who work in media sales, so having these conversations and spreading the word. Whenever a subject on like, oh, what do you think about these DEI or anti-racelessness? Oh, well, have you heard of these 6 philosophies on race? Right? Like, you answer their question with another question, and you introduce what Sheena's bringing to the table, which I think I know I was so hungry for. And then if you can just get them thinking about philosophies on race, how that lens is so liberating. At least it has been for me, and I think it will be for others. So that's what I was thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you. Thought, Sheena? Any?
Well, Bradford and I are connected. And I feel like we talk frequently, which is a privilege. But it's always good to spend time with you, Bradford. I don't know how you don't get sick of hearing me say some of the same things over and over. And you
It's a
keep coming
balm.
to
I
these.
apply it to my skin. I want to absorb it in. So good.
Well, you know, it's as simple, I think, Sheena, as giving permission that race is an illusion. Yep, that racelessness is an ideal. I think it's hard to feel it's okay to say that in some way in most settings, most mixed settings. And I think your book and your saying that out loud, saying the truth part out loud, is very helpful. So, yeah. Starlet, how about you? I haven't heard from you. And then, Mugala, I haven't heard from you. Tell what's going on in your mind. Be thinking.
Sam had her hand up.
Oh, Sam first. Sorry.
Hi, sorry, I'm not feeling camera ready today. Apologies. But yeah, I think I wanted to pick up on what Bradford said. This whole breaking notion of coming back to our humanity and breaking bread together, and coming back to where we are united. I think there has to be a desire and a willingness to open our minds up to the facts that we all have universal tendencies that lead to race, to racialization, to racism, to othering. And I think one of the things that, in addition to the philosophies of race that are really instrumental to at least starting the discussion, maybe complementary to that is just discussing psychology and our human, how we're wired. And if we really do want to, if people do really care about eliminating race or racism rather, and really, care about equity and all the things that people are clamoring for, we have to open up to those possibilities, to those universal tendencies that make all of this, that sort of created the bind that we're in now. And we can't be holding on to descriptions, these constructions of race. We can't be holding on to those, to those terminology that keeps us from, seeing each other. And so one of the things I was going to say was Theory of Racelessness is another organization that I don't know if people have heard about or listened to.
You mean
Chloe Valerie.
Theory of Enchantment.
I mean, Theory of Enchantment. Thank you. So, like, they're both theories. It's so funny. I came to Theory of Enchantment first, a couple of years ago, and I've worked with Chloe, and she has got a great theory going around, coming back to that psychology, that philosophy. She brings in psychology, Jungian psychology and philosophy, and just sort of those universal tendencies to unite people and to get rid of these. And I feel like they're complementary. I feel like, Sheena, yours is complementary. Your theory is complementary to hers, and I feel like together, the combined, that willingness, to sort of go above and beyond to unite, and not hold on to these strictures. So yeah, that's all.
Thanks, Sam. It's always good to see you, hear your voice, and spend time with you. Another person I feel I know fairly well. We've worked closely together. I don't know how you don't get sick of hearing me say the same things either, but hey, I'll take it.
Each time I hear it, I think I pick up a different things. And what I love about these forums is I get to hear other people's reactions, and I'm sure that's why you're doing it too, is to sort of build that community and just understand what the questions are, and the themes are circulating. So yeah, that's why.
Just stare down. No, I want to affirm the work in witness, and I think it's important that we see it as future oriented, that for all the desire to want the new and wanting to be free of ruling relationships, when those theories, when those ideas come bubbling up, it is our intention to quash them. And it's like, but this is what you ask for. This is what you ask for, a lens, you ask for liberation. And then we are gifted with people who have these visions. And we immediately say, oh, but the past. If we're going to move forward, we have to embrace the visionary. And that's not always the case. I know visionaries are always getting they don't get the best treatment. So I just wanted to affirm that. It's for a people coming. I think I often feel that Dr. Mason is writing for a future space, a future people, and that we should treat it as such. Yes, we have those. It's not an attempt to erase our experiences. We know what human beings are doing, but and in light of that, there are people who can still say, and we think, I'm definitely grateful for them, they can still say, we can call you to something better, something to a place, into a people, into a frame of reference or a frame of mind where these things do not have to happen. I think that takes guts. I think it's a gift, and I think we should embrace it. I think all of us are well versed in what human beings can do to each other. We're bearing witness to that now. We're well aware of that. But we also need some future-oriented people who can pull us along and say, this is not, I understand what you've gone through. I've gone through the same things, and I'm telling you, this is not going to work, and we've got to do something different. So I would just encourage us to encourage those who have these voices and visions of a future where there are no relationships of ruling. So again, I just want to commend you for repeating it, even as persons talk over, under, and through you to say, this is the way it's always been, this is the way it's going to be. It's not going to be that way. There's too many people coming up and saying, no, I see it differently. And we need to allow space for those visionaries. So I'm here to listen to you ad nauseum say the exact same thing, because that's the only way you're going to get a hearing. So I just want to encourage you just to continue to say what you've been saying. It's going to stick eventually, if not for this time, then for a time to come.
Starlet, always a privilege and honor to share space with you. And because Reverend Dr. Starlet Thomas is modest, I shared a link to her book on racelessness. It's called Take Me to the Water, the Raceless Baptism. Hold on. The Raceless Gospel as Baptismal Pedagogy for a Desegregated Church. I put a link to that in the chat for anyone who might be interested, because she brings the fire and she's known as the Raceless Gospel. You should find her on Twitter, all the social medias. Yeah,
and I think Starlet should be a guest on a future Voices session as well.
How did we get to that?
Absolutely.
We were... Gee,
I can make the connection between you, Tom, and Starlet, if that's.
I was just wanting to edify your voice and let others know there are other people from other areas of the world that are being called in the same way to deracialize things. take that as a sign, use it as encouragement. There is hope. And there are people that you all have already named, your own children and perhaps your grandchildren, who don't want the world as it is. So I think it's up to us to bear witness to a world as they want it to be. That would be our gift to them. I think that's our work for us. And Dr. Mason has a theory for us to work it through. So let's do that.
Yeah. So I'm sold, that's for sure. But I just also want to not bring down that idea or that dream or that conviction. It's probably a better word for it. But at the same time, in the U.S. political system, we have half the people in the U.S. who are saying yes to othering and victimizing and this the same dynamic that creates racism shows up everywhere, and we have to stand up against all of that, I think.
I
put
live in France, Tom, and it
yes,
is not different over
you're
here.
right. You know, John Elvire, I live in France in the winter. I'm going to be in outside of Nice.
Yes.
And so I pay attention to news media and stories in France, and I know racism is entrenched in French society.
Very subtle, absolutely. Yeah.
A year, Rose will know this, that I have been trying to open more directly topics and diversify the participation in our voices sessions. And it's very hard, frankly. I guess I feel like I'm the white guy who can't be trusted for people of color to join and be themselves and be a voice in this group. And I am definitely not giving up on that. So I hope people will continue to come, because these are all interrelated. This humanness, this leading, this creating change, this creating a better understanding is all part of this this story. We're behind you, Sheena, and we thank you, and I assume Starlet and Chloe, and this is a message that needs to become normalized in our society.
Thank you, and thank you for convening with me. Again, this is a sincere invitation for those of you in the room who I haven't already connected with. I'm on all of the platforms. You can find me often by just looking for Sheena Mason. I also have a podcast that I want to offer as a potential resource. And this will send you to my book page,